So the question is, how on earth are you meant to grow and monetize your podcast way faster as a business owner or an expert or an online coach who wants to build a podcast that grows your personal brand and attracts dream clients as well as monetization opportunities into your business? If you're watching this, you've probably been in a spot where you've been podcasting for a year, maybe 2, maybe 3, and you find yourself stuck with slow and steady growth, unable to break past your current reach. Maybe you're stuck at 100 monthly downloads, maybe 1,000 monthly downloads, maybe 10,000 monthly downloads, maybe 100,000 monthly downloads. The point is you might have been stuck at a certain plateau where your growth is essentially flatlined. And no matter what you do, the growth doesn't seem to be moving. The show doesn't seem to be picking up a lot of momentum, even though you're having amazing conversations with guests, sharing incredibly valuable content, maybe you've been posting consistently for years, and you actually enjoy the show. But again, it's not really growing and it's not really monetizing. So the question is, how do you grow your podcast? How do you go from where you are right now to being unstuck and fast tracking your growth to grow way faster? So look, after interviewing and coaching 400 plus podcasts, you'll be happy to know that what you're experiencing right now is totally normal. To be honest with you, the majority of entrepreneurs and experts with a podcast oftentimes find themselves in a spot where they are on the verge of quitting their shows, kind of considering, well, why should I keep going if I'm not getting that much of an ROI? And I want this to be an encouragement to you to know that there are very specific steps you can take in order to take your show around. It is possible. It is going to be worth it. All the time you're investing in the show, it will be worth it. And you can make an ROI from the podcast. You just need to have the right strategy. And today I want to share some of those learnings and the things that I've learned when it comes to growing and monetizing shows over the last 5 years. And I think a good place to start is by actually just calling out the areas that most entrepreneurs and experts end up just wasting a bunch of time when it comes to trying to grow their podcast and take it to that next level. So the first one is going to be either obvious or not so obvious. To me, it feels obvious because it's the one that everyone completely screws up. And the first one is this: relying on social media as a strategy for growth. When you release a new episode with a guest or maybe just yourself, you're most likely sharing maybe some promotional clips or letting your audience know that the show exists and the show is live. The issue with trying to grow your podcast using social media is the fact that social media is a terrible way to grow podcasts. And the likelihood is you're probably experiencing it yourself. You've probably been promoting your podcast. But if I was to say to you, is your promotion, is that actually working? Have you been reaching more listeners every single month? Is your podcast growing month after month after month? The more you're promoting, 9 times out of 10, the answer will be no, it's not. Like, I'm yet to meet a podcaster in the last 5 years who said, yes, using social media to promote my podcast has actually helped me grow and build a massive audience. Maybe you might have got a couple thousand views and a few social media clips, but when it comes to that viewership and exposure translating into growth and listenership for your podcast, it doesn't happen. And the reason is the majority of people who are using their phones or social media platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, whatever it might be, they're not going on these platforms to find new podcasts to listen to. Like, I see a bunch of clips online that are fantastic and I go, wow, that's a really good clip. But then I don't go on and invest the next 60 minutes or 90 minutes or maybe even 20 minutes of my time listening to the entirety of that podcast. And the likelihood is you're not doing the same thing either. So again, posting content on social media is a massive time suck for a bunch of entrepreneurs and experts with podcasts. You become overly reliant on it and you just keep doing it out of habit, even though it doesn't work. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing and strategy that most podcasters try to do to grow that just doesn't really work as a long-term strategy for both growth and monetization, especially if you're an entrepreneur expert with a podcast and you're trying to use the podcast as lead gen for your business, is simply targeting high-profile guests onto your show in hopes that they will bring in an audience to your show. Now, the logic follows, and the logic, honestly, it makes sense. If I get high-profile guests onto my podcast, they've got 100,000 followers on Instagram, they're going to come onto my show, they'll hopefully, fingers crossed, share it with their audience, and their audience will come to my podcast. My show will be exposed to a new audience. Theoretically, it sounds fantastic. It sounds great. But practically speaking, it just never plays out like that. And if you have had high-profile guests onto your show, the likelihood is they probably didn't promote it to their audience. And even when they do promote it to their audience either don't come, or when the audience do come, you might have a massive influx of a bunch of downloads for the episode. But then the next episode and the one after that you release, they don't pick up that much momentum. It's kind of like you have this influx and then everyone leaves just as fast. And it's because trying to grow your podcast long term, relying on high profile guests, doesn't really build up your show. And listeners end up coming for the guests themselves when the guest actually promotes, which again, 9 times out of 10, they don't. But when they do, they come for the guests and not for you. Sometimes you can grow using high profile guests onto your show, but only in very specific situations. And I'm going to explain what I mean later on. It really depends on the type of content strategy you have for your show. There's a very particular type of content strategy that you need in order to properly leverage high profile guests when you have this influx, to have sustained growth long term. So the second thing that people try to do to grow that simply doesn't work, which is relying on high profile guests. And then the final thing is just hoping that if they just keep at it consistently for years and they just keep publishing new episodes, that eventually the audience will come. Again, there's kind of this build it and they'll come mindset. Now, you might have had that when you first launched your show, that you thought, you know what, I know this is going to be a long-term thing. People tell me podcasters, I'm in it for the long run, right? But if you're a year, 2 years, 3 years in now, and your show is kind of flatlined at numbers that you kind of feel a bit embarrassed about, that maybe you're not even looking at your dashboard analytics because it's not really encouraging. It's a bit demotivating when you're putting in so much time, investing so much into your show, and it's not growing. So why am I saying all this? Look, I'm saying all this because so many podcasters make the mistake of thinking that just consistency alone and posting valuable content alone will guarantee that a show grows, but it rarely does. In most cases, every single client that we work with, they are consistent. They are posting incredibly meaningful conversation. And the likelihood is you've been doing that for a couple of years, but the show isn't growing. And it's because you can be consistent on the wrong things. The main reason why so many podcasts struggle to grow is because they don't have fundamentally an actual strategy to grow their podcast. It's kind of based off of hope marketing. I hope things will work out. I'm an optimist. Of course it's going to work out. Just put it out there, then eventually do this long enough, the shit will grow. But it doesn't. Now that begs a question. I'm not going to sit here and just moan and say, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. That's just what I've seen in terms of my own experience. But you let me know, there's something you've experienced yourself. So there's a bit of the question, how are you actually meant to grow a podcast that builds your personal brand, that attracts way more opportunity to your business, rather than having the podcast that's kind of just, you're not really too sure why you keep doing it. There's not really much incentive because there's no ROI. And even though the show is really valuable and you love it, it's like, well, what are we doing here sometimes? Like, I just feel like I'm stuck in a nuts and bolts just publishing new content, but what am I actually gaining from this? How do we turn it around so you have a fast growing show that you're genuinely proud of, that's reaching thousands of new listeners every single month, that you're excited to look at analytics because it just lights you up, because you know that the work you're putting in, you're getting tons more out of it. How do you do that? Well, after interviewing and coaching 400 plus podcasts, this is the 4-step growth and monetization system that we use to help our clients grow their podcasts way faster. So to really understand this and how you can apply it for yourself, there's really something fundamental that I think is so easy to overlook when it comes to podcast growth, which is asking the question, what needs to happen in order for a podcast to actually grow? I know it sounds so dumb and basic, but seriously, what things actually have to happen in order for your podcast to grow? Like, you start from first principles, like, how does a podcast grow? Well, there are 3 key things. The first is we need to be able to turn a stranger into a first-time listener. That's number 1. Number 2 is we need that listener to keep coming back for future content. If they don't come back for future content, the podcast won't grow, simply put. And if they don't come back for future content, you're unable to nurture that relationship with that listener long term, which means they'll never buy your stuff and you won't make any money, right? So you need a way to get those listeners coming back for more, to consume more of your content, to binge your back catalog, to follow along with your future content. And then, of course, the obvious one, which is number 3, you need to just get a ton of exposure consistently on your show. You need to consistently, month after month, reach new listeners. Those are the 3 things you need to do in order to grow a podcast. Turn a stranger into a first-time listener, get that stranger to keep coming back for more, to become a fan of your show, and to get a ton more exposure onto your show in order to turn more strangers into listeners and to get those listeners coming back for more. It's kind of this feedback loop. Now, it sounds simple enough, right? Simple enough. Makes sense. Makes total sense. But I think what screws up so many podcasters is the fact that you end up getting stuck in the nuts and bolts of running a podcast, that you put in all the time and energy and the show isn't growing. And a lot of the time, the conclusion that you've probably come to is that the reason why the show isn't growing is because, well, simply put, you haven't got enough exposure. There's the 3rd piece that's missing, that if you just had more reach, then the podcast will grow. Because let's be honest, you've probably had a few messages of, super fans who love your show, tell you how meaningful your content actually is, to tell you how valuable it is. So of course, all you need is more exposure to grow the show. Now, don't get me wrong, your content probably is super valuable and it probably is extremely meaningful, but just focus on exposure 9 times out of 10 from what we've experienced doesn't grow your show and isn't the reason, more importantly, why your podcast isn't growing or monetizing as fast as you'd like. The reason is because most podcasters skip over the first 2 steps, which is how do I position the podcast in a way to turn a stranger into a first-time listener? What does that actually mean? I'm going to break that down in just a moment. And then the second thing is, how the hell do I get this listener coming back for more? Like, what is my retention strategy? Like, do you have a retention strategy where you have an ecosystem built to keep listeners binging your content? Most people don't really have a retention strategy. But think about how much faster it would be for you to grow if you had more listeners keep listening to your podcast. Now, I want to make a distinction. The fact that you're stuck at this plateau of, let's say, 1,000 downloads per month or $100,000 per month, it doesn't mean that the exact same listeners listen to your content. Oftentimes what we see is we have 1,000 new listeners listen to the show, for example, 1 month, then they like one episode, love it, and then the next episode they don't like, so they leave. And we have a bunch of new listeners who like the next episode. So you have this filtration system where new listeners come in at the same rate as new listeners leaving, which means they're not the same listeners. And that's a mistake that a lot of podcasters make. They assume they have the exact same listeners coming back for more every single episode. Now, don't get me wrong, we have a core audience base who follow your show, but that's not the majority of people. Now, the amazing thing is once you do fix the first and second step, turning more strangers into listeners and getting those listeners coming back for future content, the show naturally starts to grow. Let's say, for example, you're promoting on social media, you are at Apple and Spotify and all the directory platforms where people listen to podcasts, you'll probably get a ton of exposure onto your show already. But if loads of people are viewing your podcast and they're not clicking play for the first time because of conversion issues, meaning your cover art, and again, I'm going to walk you through what that looks like in just a second, then they're never going to become a listener. You've got all this exposure, but the show doesn't grow. And then let's say, for example, people do click play, but then they don't binge your back catalog or they don't follow along for new episodes. How are you going to grow the podcast month after month after month? You can get all the exposure on earth if you can't convert more of those strangers into first-time listeners. And if you can't get those first-time listeners coming back to binge future content, the show won't grow. You can do all the exposure in the world, the show just doesn't grow. And that is most likely the situation that you found yourself in. So these are the 4 steps that we take with our clients to fix that. The first step is building your show's unique selling point, your USP. Podcasting is getting more and more competitive. So how do we make sure that your show stands out among the competition? Why should someone pick you over the industry leader in your space? And that really comes down to your USP. So what makes you different from everyone else out there? Look, when you make a USP, a unique selling point, and you might have one, oftentimes clients have ideas of what USP is. And just to be clear, a USP is not, I say how it is, I give honest take, I give actionable advice, in-depth stories. Like, that's just a typical podcast, right? That's not an actual USP. A USP is something that makes your show objectively different compared to everything else. So some examples of clients' USPs. We had a client who had a leadership podcast. She was stuck at 4,000 monthly downloads after 7 years of podcasting. And she blew past 30,000 monthly downloads whilst working with our team because we helped her form a USP. She had a leadership podcast and she found that it was harder and harder for her to cut through the noise because everyone else is doing typical interview-based podcasts where they interview leaders about communication. Whereas for her, we needed something slightly different. So we decided to create a new segment for a show where we designed 10-minute bite-sized episodes that were kind of like case studies where she broke down A-list celebrities, their characteristics and traits that made them influential leaders and great communicators. This made her show stand out from everyone else who had a generic, interview-based podcast. So as a result, when new listeners saw her show, number one, they loved it. They clicked play straight away. They turned into an actual first-time listener. But when they listened to it, they kept coming back for more because they've never experienced a show quite like this. Everyone else is interview-based. The top leaders talk about, having those interviews. Whereas for hers, it's positioned as something totally different. They could only get that content from her show. So they kept coming back for more. And that's how her show grew massively because she was able to have a clear positioning, a USP, that made her show different all of the competition. And you need the same for your podcast if you want to stand out and gain traction fast. Now, once you have a USP, the second piece is going to be really important is building what we call a demand-based content strategy, which simply means pinpointing in your space what are the hot and trending topics that are already picking up so much traction. Now, this is vital, and a lot of us find this difficult to do because it feels like cheating or feels kind of lazy. Or honestly, for the most part, when you're an expert and entrepreneur in your space, you kind of have ideas of what you think a good episode will be, or, you might speak to a client, or you might, just see stuff online, then decide to make a podcast episode about it. Or maybe, just maybe, you're getting inundated with a bunch of guests and you're just picking and choosing guests that you think might be a good fit for your show. But most podcasters don't really plan ahead intentionally of, hey, the listeners I'm trying to reach with my podcast, what specific content are they currently consuming in my space, right? Like, really think about that. Like, who am I trying to reach? Who's the specific avatar I'm trying to reach? For us, is entrepreneurs and experts of podcasts who are struggling to grow. How do I make sure that every single episode is binge-worthy for the specific listener? But more importantly, how do I make sure I don't just guess, but I figure out what's hot and trending in my space right now? So what does that look like? It looks like going onto popular forums and seeing the most popular questions. It looks like, going on Google blogs, typing in specific keywords and seeing which topics has the most traffic. It looks like going onto YouTube and just seeing, hey, other creators in my space, what topics are they covering and how can I cover a similar topic on my show? Because I know that these topics are proven to gain traction. The point is, you decide which topics you're going to cover on your show based on demand, not guesswork. Based on what's proven to gain traction, not based on what your next guest wants to talk about. Based on the listeners you're trying to attract and what's going to specifically attract them. Now, when you do this, and oftentimes podcasters don't do this, and here's why this is an issue. Let's say you get a high-profile guest onto your show. They spoke about fitness, and they actually promoted the podcast, and they had tons of people who viewed your episode. And let's say your episodes were averaging 100 downloads per episode, and then it just blew up to, let's say, 1,000. And it was all about fitness. Now, let's say the majority of people loved your show because the podcast is good, it's valuable, we had a great conversation, and they look for your back catalog, and then they just see, honestly, just a bunch of random topics around personal development, around business, or maybe let's say it's in fitness, right? But then the next one is talking about like the carnivore diet, but they're not interested in the carnivore diet. And then the one after that is talking about weight loss when they actually are into CrossFit. Then the next one talks all about, fitness when you're over 40. But again, they're in their 30s and they're into CrossFit. Think about this. Your listeners discover you through one particular episode because they're interested in one particular topic. And let's say that's CrossFit. If the rest of your content in your podcast isn't specifically about that topic that got them interested in the first place, that got them to click play and listen in the first place, what's the likelihood they stick around if the episodes aren't highly relevant to them? And again, even though it's broadly about fitness and losing weight, etc., your content needs to be extremely specific in order to retain this person. And that's where so many podcasts screw up because it's so subtle. You could have a business podcast, have an episode about sales blow up, and then the next one is about operations and like team management. But I came in for sales and they want more sales podcasts and I'm talking about operations. So that listener just dips. Even though they've got a business, it's not a thing they came in for. So it needs to be extremely targeted and extremely focused on a particular topic, trying to serve and solve a particular problem. When you do this, you'll have way more listeners coming back for more, and you'll see your monthly growth finally start ticking upwards in the right direction. So step number 1, build your USP so you stand out from the crowd and you gain traction way faster. Step number 2, build a demand-based content strategy so you keep more listeners coming back for more. And also make sure that it's super targeted. Every single episode is highly relevant for that person. Now, step number 3 and 4 are all to do with exposure, the exciting part. Step number 3 is really optimizing your show for podcast SEO. Now, podcast SEO is the process of ranking your podcast higher on Apple and Spotify. Those are the platforms new listeners go to discover new shows to listen to. And this is extremely powerful. If you don't rank high on Apple and Spotify and you're trying to grow your podcast, how are you meant to grow if people can't organically find your show? So again, people will literally type in on Apple Podcast, how to reduce anxiety. And if you have an anxiety podcast and you're not ranking on Apple and Spotify, how can you expect people to reach you when they can't actually find you? Now, to give you an example of why this is so powerful, we had a client who was on the verge of quitting her show. Her name was Raven. She was struggling to hit 400 monthly downloads for around 2 years, 400 monthly downloads. And the one thing that was missing for her, and this is often the massive thing that's missing when it comes to exposure, because again, social media clearly doesn't work, getting high-profile guests on your podcast to interview them also clearly doesn't work, and just staying consistent clearly doesn't work. If not, you wouldn't be watching this video right now. So Raven, we fixed the podcast SEO and she grew to 23,000 monthly downloads. But this is also just a trend we see across a bunch of different clients. Like we had a client in the food space. She was stuck below, I think it was like 4,000 monthly downloads for like 2 years. She came, started working with us, and their podcast now literally blew up and is getting around over 20,000 monthly downloads. It's insane. Again, because they finally started ranking on page 1 of Apple and Spotify. That's the power of podcast SEO. So that's great, and those results are amazing, but how can you start ranking for more of the right terms and have more of the right listeners find your show organically? Wouldn't that be great? How great would that be to have thousands of new listeners finding your podcast every single month because you're finally visible on the platform they're actually looking on? So here's our process. Number 1, focus on discoverability. So think about the highly searched keywords in your space. Simply ask yourself, hey, what keywords my audience type in order to find my podcast? And then you want to add those keywords. So for me, it might be how to grow a podcast. For my other client, it might be, how to reduce anxiety or anxiety podcast or stress management. Find these highly searched keywords and simply start adding them to more of your episode titles, your show name, your actual description, your show notes. Add that everywhere on your podcast so that these platforms know to show your show to more of the right listeners. That's discoverability, rank for the right keywords. Then it's visibility. How do we make sure your show stands out from the competition and it's actually clicked on? Because it's not just you who shows up on results, it's you versus everyone else. This means optimizing your show for an amazing cover art. It means having an extremely attractive show name that's super targeted and calls out the right listener. We had a client who had a show name that was called Break the Chain from the 9 to 5. And I was like, again, that sounds fancy, sounds very motivational, but it's very vague and unspecific. And we changed it to Toolbox Talks for Electrician, how to save time and make more money as a self-employed electrician, which is way more clear and way more specific. Which meant that when people found the show on Apple and Spotify, they actually converted, they actually clicked play and they listened. And of course, because he had a tag to content strategy, they kept listening and the show actually grew. His show went from literally struggling to hit 40 downloads per episode and blew up to getting around 600 downloads per episode within like 4 months, I think 3 to 4 months, which again is absolutely nuts. So that's visibility, making sure your show is actually clicked on over the competition. Again, look at your cover art, your show name, episode titles, show notes, all the area that a new listener would see in order to decide whether to click play or listen. And by the way, you can see how this is also a conversion piece when it comes to exposure. We're getting exposure by ranking you on page 1 on Apple and Spotify, but just because you have exposure doesn't mean that person's going to click play and listen. Same way, you might promote on social media and people might go to your podcast, but if it's not clear who the show is for and it's very vague and unspecific, why would they click play? They just won't. So you've got that exposure, but you need to convert that exposure into actual listenership. And that is visibility. And then the third part of podcast SEO is user engagement. So really looking at your reviews, just getting some reviews on your show would do. That's more so for social proof. And again, it's kind of a conversion piece. You just want just some reviews on your show to show people that your podcast is legit, that people like it. Again, just social proof. But a more important part that most people skip over is your user engagement. If you think about it, Apple and Spotify, their entire incentive is to keep users on their platform. Now, if your podcast isn't doing that, meaning people click play on your episode and then they just dip straight away because maybe the intro was crap, the audio was rubbish, or maybe they didn't feel like the show was made for them, that sends a bad signal to Apple and Spotify saying this show isn't worth sharing to more people. Because why would they share the show to more people and rank your show higher if your episodes aren't keeping people engaged? So this is user engagement. Our goal is to increase the listen time of our podcast, our retention rate. This is essentially, on average, how much of your content do listeners consume? We want this number to be around 80%. So you can go to Apple Podcast Connect and it will literally tell you on average, where do people drop off? Now, this is super important because it means that, number one, it tells the quality of your podcast. Number two, it sends a positive signal when this is really high to Apple and Spotify because it tells them that you should share this with more people because people are staying on, listening. And number three, it means that you can actually build a rapport with your audience. You can tell that the quality of your content is legitimately good, objectively good, because a lot of people, the majority of people, are consuming your content. Now, for most people, their intro is going to be a massive issue. We see a massive dip typically around the first 90 seconds, and because people's intros aren't optimized. So for your intros, a quick fix is start with a strong hook, not a teaser, a strong hook. Say exactly what people are going to gain from an episode. And then start by describing in a sentence what the podcast does for people. This just sells the actual podcast and lets people know they're in the right place. And then finally, state 3 clear benefits they're going to gain by sticking around and listening to your, 10, 20, 30 hour-long podcast. Just incentivize people to keep listening and tell them why they can't afford not to listen. This makes a huge difference. We had a client called Jane. He literally went from 40% retention time to doubling that and then tripling her listenership as a result of that, because more people listened to you through to her content, got to the end, thought it was high value, went through a back catalog, binged of the rest of it. The show grew. Anyway, do you get the point? That only was possible because we fixed her user engagement, her retention time. So that's the third thing when it comes to podcast SEO if you want to rank your show higher on Apple and Spotify, which I presume you probably will want to do. And that is podcast SEO. Discoverability, ranking for the right keywords and search terms, visibility, being seen and clicked on over the competition, actually converting people, and then user engagement, making sure people consume more of your content when they click play. Now, the final part that we encourage our clients to do that's been massive when it comes to the right type of exposure is simply guesting on more shows, collaborating with other podcasts. Because if you want to reach more podcast listeners, you should probably reach podcast listeners where podcast listeners are, which is oftentimes listening to other people's podcasts. So instead of you getting high-profile guests onto your podcast, the idea is, why don't we, instead of just shining a spotlight on a bunch of guests and giving them business and giving them an audience and a platform, why don't we find other people's podcasts who have a big audience already, the audience that we're trying to reach and break into? Why don't we just place ourselves in front of their audience, shortcut our way to a much bigger audience who are the right people that we want to reach, share a ton of value endlessly on their show, and then turn some of their audience into our own because we've just been exposed to a new audience. Again, a bunch of free promotion because the actual host of the show will promote that podcast episode to their audience, the same way that when you have a guest onto your podcast, you're promoting them to your audience. And doing this consistently over time allows you to reach more of the right listeners where listeners are. Allows you to build your authority, build your personal brand within your space, and attract way more of the right listeners. And within this process, I have personally closed clients and gained customers from this process. And it works like magic because you're the one given the platform, you're the one who has a spotlight on you, and you're the one who's providing the value and being positioned as an expert on someone else's show. That's the right type of exposure. Now, it's really important that we have all of these things in place, meaning a show that has a USP and stands out from the crowd, a show that has a dynamic content strategy and is keeping listeners coming back for more, a show that is optimal for podcast SEO so that people can find you where they're looking for your show, and finally, a show where you are consistently being exposed to a ton of the right listeners by you featuring as a guest on other people's show. That really is a 4-step growth and monetization system. And the important thing is the monetization piece, like where does that come in? Our clients, just by the nature of them fixing their growth issues, they start attracting way more of the right audience and a bigger audience who are ideal clients for their actual podcast. So now when they do give a CTA at the end of the episode to work with them or book on a call or buy their stuff, more of the right listeners are finding their show and therefore buy their stuff. The faster your show grows and the more of the right listeners you attract to your podcast and keep listening and coming back for more, the more they're nurtured, the more they build a like, know, and trust, and the more they'll buy from you. So look, I'm saying this because I want you to know that this whole podcast thing, this growing the podcast stuff, this building an audience and monetizing the podcast, it absolutely is possible. I've shown you tons of examples throughout this entire video, but you do need the strategy. You can't just rely on hope marketing that things will just work themselves out because they don't. A lot of this stuff is fundamental stuff that people just oftentimes skip over because it feels boring and not sexy and not shining. But I can promise you once again, your time will be worth it if you do have a strategy, if you follow this stuff piece by piece. It will work. I know it works. I've seen it work for so many of my clients. And I would love to see it work for you. So keep going. You've got this. And if you like this, if you have any more questions, leave a comment down below in the description. I'll get back to you. And with that being said, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.